Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our special SCOTONOMICS live episode for you this evening. Hello to everyone who's watching us on Facebook, Twitter, and also on YouTube. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. First thing I'd like to do is invite my co-host, Kieran Van Sweden, onto stage with me. Hello, Kieran. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yes, very well, thank you. And now I'm going to bring on our two guests this evening. First of all, we have Ian Stewart. Hello, Ian. How are you doing?
Hello, William and Kieran. Thank you for inviting me.
Nope, nice to see you.
Yeah, we're delighted to have you, Ian. So I wanted to welcome you.
Hold on, Kieran. Hold on, Kieran. I'm going to get Robbie on as well. Yeah.
Hello, everyone.
Okay. Nearly, Robbie. Robbie, nice for you to join us as well. How are you doing?
Very well. Yes, indeed. Yes. Absolutely fine. Looking forward to this very much.
Good. Fantastic. Well, we're going to have quite as wide a conversation as we can this evening. Any questions you've got for the four of us on anything that's been happening recently, or your thoughts on Scotland's kind of economic landscape, we'll try and answer that for you. But we've got two particular things we're going to cover this evening, and then throw in any questions for you. So Kieran's going to ask most of the questions this evening, so I'll pass over to you, Kieran.
Well, Ian, welcome to Scottonomics, and Robbie, welcome back. Ian, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself to start off with?
Yes, very happy to, Kieran. Thank you. Yeah, well, I was brought up in Kirkcudbrightshire and been a lifelong nationalist, really. And I actually attribute that to a very good state education at Kirkcudbright Academy, where I learned that most valuable of all things, which is the capability to use critical thinking. Read behind the headlines, read behind the news. So, I mean, my background was there. At an early age, I joined the Royal Bank of Scotland down in Dumfriesshire and had various jobs in the Royal Bank, starting off basically as a tea boy in 1969, I think it was, and ended up running head of department, head of debit cards in the Royal Bank, and also board director on a number of companies, not least Switch in the UK, which was the most successful debit card program probably anywhere at the time. And it was also the UK's only director on MasterCard's Global Debit Card Advisory Board. So a lad of parts, I would describe myself as, and that's basically my background.
So banking firmly is your background. So tell us, how long have you been in the Scottish Currency Group? How long has it been?
I personally have been
operating.
Yeah, I personally have been in the currency group for over 3 years now. It was started 6 years ago by Tim Rideout. My own interest, of course, goes back to the referendum campaign in 2014, whereby, and we'll all remember this, those of us who watched it, we saw our case disappear when Alex Salmond was told on nationwide TV that, no, you cannot share sterling. And, you know, it's my own personal opinion, but that actually lost us the referendum because he had no plan B. And, you know, the idea that you can be an independent country sharing another currency from another country, it just doesn't make sense to me. And in my job, in my latter years, last 10 years, my career, I did travel extensively throughout Europe and was frequently in European countries of equivalent size and less generously endowed with assets than Scotland. And all of them were doing far better than Scotland has ever done. And in fact, far better than Scotland will ever do under rule from a foreign country, which, you know, England would be were we independent. I mean, we really need to take control of our own resources and take responsibility for ourselves.
Yes, I mean, I can attest to that experience, and I'm sure William can as well, because obviously I lived in the Netherlands for 5 years and saw a small country thriving in a way that clearly Scotland should be. So tell us why you want to set up the Scottish Monetary Research Institute.
Well, you know, myself and my colleagues, Robbie, and a small group of people have been running the Scottish Currency Group, set up by Tim Rideout 6 years ago. We've all been involved for over 3 years. And we've submitted various papers to the Scottish Government. We've sent a book called The Road to the Scottish Currency back in, I think it was February 2022. I personally have met and discussed openly with Ian Blackford, Kate Forbes, Drew Henry, a number of people in SNP leadership, and tried to actually articulate and convince them of the necessity to actually position ourselves to be able to issue our own currency on day one of independence. And that's the key point. We have to position ourselves to be capable of issuing our own currency on day one of independence. And the reason we're moving from the Scottish Currency Group into hoping to set up the Scottish Monetary Research Institute in September is to bring more professionalism in terms of people from industry and commerce who are active in the Scottish economy right now, because it's no secret. I mean, I myself am in retirement age. One or two of us are in that category, and we'd really like to bring in a new generation to actually take the fight forward, and people who are well networked, and we know these people exist, and we were putting out a call to them to actually step forward and help us to progress the need to set up a central bank, treasury, and the functions of a normal country. Basically, like Alistair Gray, the late Alistair Gray, once famously quoted, act as though you are already living in an independent country. That's what we want to do.
Do you envisage that you'll bring in academics from other countries, experts from other countries as well to this project?
Yeah. Yes, that's a very good question, Kieran. We do see ourselves bringing in academics and also professional people from an international stage, and particularly from countries which have already gone through the process of issuing their own currency, some of which would be emerging countries from the former Soviet Union, but others from Africa, which, in a similar way to Scotland, if we, and let's hope we will, create a Scottish pound as a separate independent currency. I mean, the couple of countries of great interest as us in South Africa, which were previously dependent on the South African rand, but have actually transitioned to their own currency, and have actually, from that process, they have benefited dramatically in terms of improving the lives of their citizens. Because this is a key point. We're not interested in setting up our own currency just because we think it'd be a good thing to do. We see setting up our own currency as a fundamental step to being able to offer better future for the people of Scotland.
Yeah, I completely. I wondered if we had any questions for our audience here.
Kieran, we're getting a little bit of feedback from your when you're talking. I'm just wondering if you've got the YouTube open or your iPad open or something like that.
I've got my iPad open now.
Let's see if it's that. Yeah, Ian, have you got an idea of the timeline for the Research Institute?
Yeah, we'll hope to set up in September, and we're hoping to get finance. I mean, that's the other thing that we sadly lack in the Scottish Currency Group. I mean, we're all a group of volunteers who dedicate our time willingly and generously to promote the idea of a Scottish currency. We would hope that by setting up the Scottish Monetary Research Institute, we could attract funding from serious players who believe in Scottish independence. And we would hope to be able to put together a programme from probably a 3-year rolling programme. That would be the target. I mean, we're encouraged by John Swinney as he sets the agenda to say we could achieve independence within 5 years. So, I mean, if that is the case, which we hope is the case, then we think a 3-year positioning for the Scottish Monetary Research Group as an initial objective is realistic.
Great. We've got a question here from Charles. Charles, I just wonder if we've still got that reverb, Kieran. I think it might be on anything there. No. Okay. So Charles asked, could Scotland link up with and be accepted into the international financial networks before actual independence? So I'm not sure exactly what Charles means by that, but have either of you got Ian, would you be able to answer that question? Could Scotland link up with and be accepted into international financial networks before we become independent?
Well, Scotland is already linked to international networks, obviously through sterling and through the UK. I mean, we couldn't really be linked up to the international financial community until we issued our own Scottish currency. So I don't really see us moving beyond that. The key thing is that while we are still part of the United Kingdom, even after we've voted for independence, there is going to be a transition period when we will be putting in place all the infrastructure required to connect to that international financial community. But there will be a switch. There will be a day when we make that switch. And that's when we will connect the international community with our own Scottish pound.
Yeah, so Charles just clarified there. I mean, the various digital systems for international payments.
Yeah.
And that's the type of thing that would be set up during the transition period.
Yeah, it depends what you mean as well by digital systems, digital payments. I mean, Visa and MasterCard, they're the global leaders in personal payments, and I mean, all their transactions are digital in the sense that they pass through wires. And I mean, Scotland would of course be well, certainly retail banks in Scotland would look to join up with Visa and MasterCard like any other normal country.
Yeah, would it be fair to say, am I feeding back? Is it me? I'm not sure. Would it be fair to say that it would be quite quick to set up a digital currency? Maybe it would take a little bit longer to set up an actual physical currency?
Actually, I think it would be the opposite. Issuing banknotes and coins is probably the most straightforward thing you can do. And as an example of that, the former Soviet states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, these countries, when they actually issued their own currency, their banking systems and their payment systems were by Western European standards not well developed. They were still cash economies. And that is very simple. In a cash economy, you basically say that from next Wednesday, the former Russian ruble is no longer acceptable. And by the way, if you take them to your local branch, we will issue our own local currency. And that's then new banknotes and coin. That's the simplest part of actually issuing your own currency. Payment systems are much more complex. As that last inquirer made the point, the digital currency and digital payments, Visa, MasterCard, SWIFT, all these systems are interconnected, a number of players, even domestically, and could be hundreds internationally. So it takes, I know from my own experience, Visa and MasterCard, they can actually load a new currency onto their global systems, but they require 2 years' notice to guarantee that that new currency code will be populated through their entire global network. So coins and banknotes, very simple. Payments, more complex.
Yeah, that reinforces your point that you really need to prepare the currency and the central bank before we get that vote for independence. That's really important, isn't it?
Well, we can certainly start that work. Yes, now.
Yeah,
that would be a recommendation.
I've really got all my questions now. Do we have any more before we move on to Robbie?
No, we'll come back with some more questions around the currency and the adoption and things like that. But yeah, let's hear from Robbie. That'd be great.
So, Robbie, why did you decide to write How to Think Like an Economist?
Okay, I suppose in some ways I didn't make the decision. My agent phoned me up and said, I'm in Edinburgh. Do you want to go for a pint? I've got an idea. And essentially, there's a series which Bloomsbury has, which is called How to Think. How to Think Like an Economist is the third one in it. So we've already had How to Think Politically, How to Think Like a Philosopher, and now How to Think Like an Economist. So perhaps I'll turn the question around slightly differently. Why did Bloomsbury think I'd be a good person to write it? And I suppose the answer is that on and off for the last 40 years, I've been thinking about what's in the book. In fact, I'm going to suggest the book's got the wrong title. You're not going to find out how to think like an economist by reading this. You're going to find out how I think. So it's a very personal book.
Yeah, and also it's a very historical book as well. In the introduction, you wrote that economics, therefore, began as a set of arguments about the ethical behaviour of Athenian citizens. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more for our audience?
Absolutely. If we're thinking about when economics actually begins or economic thinking starts to be written down, it's in the century or so when Athenian culture flourishes between the middle of the 5th century BC to 4th century BC. So, and we're looking at philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and also Aristotle. And essentially what they were trying to do was to think about how, well, a question which Ian has also been touching on in some ways, how do we use money wisely? And what they were trying to do was thinking originally, I mean, if you look at what we're actually talking about here, it's knowledge about household management. So that's really what we're talking about with economics. And so you can think of the Athenian household, slave-owning society, writing for the citizens, and I think we're probably going to see something about the role of women in economics while we're talking. Athenian women had far fewer rights than women nowadays would, or even women in the 19th century. So it's very much a case of writing for a male leisure class. How do you actually make sure that your slaves run your house so that you have a good life? And then thinking as well, and this is part of the philosophy side, well, what does the good life consist of? It consists about thinking about the nature of wisdom, the nature of virtue, but also thinking about how to benefit your other citizens, to become a philanthropist within the city. Now, so that's where economics starts from.
Now, I'm going to move on to, I think it's the second chapter, and it's about Thomas Aquinas. And you stated that in that chapter, that lay people wanted guidance about how to manage resources without falling into the sin of avarice. And this would have been a moral quandary for Christians, wasn't it? You know, how did they cope with that at that time?
Well, absolutely. In fact, I've touched on the Greeks. And then what happens after that is that all these ideas percolate around the Mediterranean. So I could also have said quite a lot about what was happening in the Greek church and the church fathers, who were very much opposed to the accumulation of wealth. In Christian thought, there is at least 1,000 years in which the only way to get to heaven was to be poor. So having wealth was seen as something complicated. And I think that really throwing a stone into that is we have the development of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula, which I think is the only major religion founded by a merchant. And so Islam took these Greek ideas and started to think about a very different question. If the Greek question is very much about practical wisdom, it's thinking about how to manage the household well. The question which Muslim and then later Christian philosophers, who took their ideas from Muslim philosophy, by the way, so economics has gone through this Muslim transformation, they were much more concerned about justice. Justice in exchange in particular, making sure that when I sell you something, I'm charging you a fair or a just price. So the idea that we've got, particularly with Aquinas, and I would also mention here the absolutely wonderful Scottish philosopher John Duns Scotus, that what Aquinas and Scotus were thinking about was how is it that we can actually put together a society in which wealth is used justly. And what they would always say is, if you're at all uncertain, if you think your money might be in some way contaminated by sin, give it to the church, that'll purify it. So plenty of ideas there about how to use money justly.
Yeah, and you say later on in that chapter as well that Aquinas argued that sellers only actually only act justly when they disclose all relevant information. And how can we expect that to work today?
Well, that I would have to say, in many markets, that is a fundamental point of law. If you sell me a car and you don't tell me that it's in a dangerous condition, I can ask for the contract to be voided. Ian will be able to tell you this, of course, that if you're paying by credit card, you've got a cooling off period, and during that time you can cancel the payment if you're not satisfied with the quality of the goods. So I would say that in many ways, truth-telling is absolutely fundamental. I will throw in a plug here for a book which my students have enjoyed reading very much, and that is by George Akerlof and Robert Schiller. It's called Fishing for Fools. And essentially what it's saying in it is, well, there are two ways in which we can actually run an economy well. One is very much along the lines of acting justly, acting ethically. And the other one is taking well, I'm not going to call it a marketing approach, but what you might actually think of as being the second-hand car salesman approach. You trade on your reputation. And again, I'm going to come back to Scottish banking. We saw that very much with Scottish banking in the first decade of this century, where Scottish banks grew until, in fact, by some measures, Royal Bank for a few months was the largest bank in the world. Trouble was, it wasn't being done wisely or justly or in any other way. They were trading on the 300-year-old reputation of Scottish banks, and they blew it in roughly 3 years.
Yes. Not good. So moving on to Alfred Marshall, which I was very interested in because we had a previous guest on, Jane Gleeson White, who wasn't a fan of Alfred Marshall. But after publishing the Principles of Economics in 1890, you state that Marshall put economics on a recognisably modern footing. Why do you think that? Why do you say that?
Well, the very simplest explanation I could give of that would be that before Marshall, no one had drawn supply and demand curves, which are the sorts of things which we would think about this absolutely fundamental. Nobody thought about markets in the way of, if there's excess supply, obviously prices are going to go down. If there's excess supply, prices are going to be pushed downwards. If there's excess demand, prices are going to be pushed upwards. There's going to be a unique quantity traded in equilibrium. That quantity traded is going to be the economically efficient output, where everyone who is willing to sell at the market price is able to find a buyer, and everyone who's willing to buy at the market price is able to find a seller. So there's a whole lot of stuff around the nature of markets which Marshall got down in a very modern way. And he was also the person who, in the last third of the 18th century, economists started to realize that what actually matters very much isn't the average value of goods, but the value of what economists call the margin. So thinking about small changes in quantities being produced, rather than the average value of all the goods being produced. And so Marshall's marginal approach is still what is taught. I mean, the principles remained in print, or have been in print ever since. They were still being used as an introductory textbook in economics in some British universities in the early 1960s. So yes, a huge influence on not just on the teaching of economics. By the way, one thing I would say, of all the people I wrote about, and there's about 30 people in the book, Marshall is the one I like least. So I'm a bit with Jane Gleeson White in that.
Yes. So as I read the chapter, I thought, this is quite an interesting man. He says, burn the mathematics, which is something that, likes as Steve Keen will say today. And that economics would be good if it was like, or if it was, like biology, which appeals to me, obviously, as a life sciences graduate. But then I understood what Jane was saying was that he campaigned against women graduating. Oh,
there's an even more remarkable story. Marshall's wife, Mary Paley, she was the first. Now, she couldn't be a graduate because women couldn't graduate from Cambridge, but she was the first woman to complete effectively an economics degree at Cambridge University in 1872. Marshall was one of her teachers. So in the 1870s, as a young man, what age was he then? He was about 30. As a young man, Marshall was actually very interested in women's education and was one of the people that supported the foundation of Newnham College. They married, and in 1877, Mary Paley had a contract to write a book called Economics of Industry. Now, unlike her husband, she produced it on time. Marshall was dreadful at putting things off. He was a hypochondriac. He liked to. I had to explain this one to my editor, that when I said he enjoyed ill health, what I meant by that was he got the world dancing around him. Because, I'm not well enough to do this. None of this stopped him from doing 500-mile hikes through the Alps during every summer. I'm too unwell to think at the moment. So Marshall, a very manipulative person in many ways. And when he came to, he agreed that what he would do was take over Economics of Industry. He eventually had it ruled, because he saw it as prefiguring too much of what was going to be in the principles. So I think that there's a real argument there. Well, how? And I suppose the last thing that I'll finish off with there, Mary Paley outlived Alfred Marshall by, I think it was 14 years. She became the founding librarian of the Marshall Library in Cambridge. And she threw herself into this with absolute enthusiasm. Austin Robinson, whose wife Joan Robinson didn't get the Nobel Prize for economics, and there's an interesting story about that as well. But Austin Robinson, just could not understand how Marshall could possibly have ignored his wife's genius for 50 years. Yeah. Yeah. So you work with her. Yes,
absolutely. Yes.
So yes. So that's some of the reasons that I don't like Marshall.
Yeah, he definitely he married well. Around 65 years after Marshall's misogynistic campaigning, Elinor Ostrom struggled for fair treatment at UCLA. However, she won the 2009 Nobel Memorial Prize. I thought her research into polycentric institutions was very interesting to me. What are your thoughts on this?
Before I do that, can I get into one other thing? 40 years, so 1969, Nobel Prize, Nobel Memorial Prize is instituted. And for the first 40 years, it goes to a man, or goes to men. 2009, I think that they were going, it's 40 years since we instituted this, we've got to find a woman. They found a political scientist. Elinor Ostrom was never held any position within an economics department. In fact, one of the things that she points out is that you've mentioned UCLA, where the politics department wasn't terribly keen on taking so many women. There were 4 out of 40, because their view was that women would struggle in the labour market, and that would be bad for the department's reputation. So what you can see is the way that it builds on there. Now, as a schoolgirl, she was told, don't do maths. And Ostrom's interesting in all sorts of ways. She comes from Hollywood, but she grew up, and so she went to Santa Monica Academy, which is one of the best schools in California, or was at the time one of the best schools in California, but she was one of the poor girls. So it never really occurred to her that she would have a career as an academic. So she studied politics in UCLA. She went to Boston with her first husband, and that marriage didn't last because she had academic ambitions. So she came back, applied to do an economics degree initially, and was turned down because she didn't have the maths. And then even in politics, people were going, well, why are we taking on all these women? It continued afterwards. The year that she graduated, she and her husband, who was admittedly 12 years older, had already an established tenure position. They moved, and she was only able to get essentially a job as a visiting lecturer, or would be allowed to take some of the first-year classes, but not to do anything important. By the time she had been doing research for about 15 years, it was quite clear that she, rather than Victor, was the intellectual leader. Sorry, that's what we've got there. Now, polycentric ideas are absolutely fascinating, because what they're saying is essentially what we're going to get is that communities are going to form the institutions which they need to govern themselves. And they're going to found them at the scale which is optimal for the problems which they're going to face. So given that this is a programme where I guess many of the audience are going to be supporters of Scottish independence, this is one of the arguments for Scottish independence, that it would be just so much more efficient to have decisions made in Scotland for Scotland than to have decisions being made by the UK for Scotland. And so there are all sorts of arguments which come out of that, which I think are particularly relevant. I think the other thing which is interesting about it is the way in which these particular institutions can endure. Some of the examples which she's looked at of self-maintained organisations have origins that go back to, well, to the time when Aquinas was writing. So we're going back 700, 800 years. So great stability. Anyway, that's enough about it. That's all I'll say about it.
Yeah, I thought that was particularly interesting for me as a counsellor and you know, a fan of subsidiarity. My last question about the book is, which economic ideas from this book do you think have the most relevance for the world today?
I mean, I really think, and this is something which has been picked up on by Angus Deaton, the only the only living Scots-born winner of the Nobel Memorial Prize. And Angus Deaton has spent a lot of time recently worrying about the gap which has opened up between economics and other social scientists. So I've mentioned there that Elinor Ostrom can win the Nobel Prize in economics, although she was a political scientist. That's been something that's been true throughout the 50 years that the Nobel Prize, 50 odd years that the Nobel Prize has been awarded. But I think what's particularly worrying Deaton is what are the links with philosophy? And so we started off with Greek philosophy, we mentioned Christian theology. We can actually see within economics, we can see quite a few points at which philosophical problems turn out to be important. So let me give you the shortest definition of economics I can. There are 4 civic virtues, according to Aristotle. Prudence, practical wisdom, that's what Aristotle emphasized. There's justice, that's Aquinas. Temperance, which has nothing to do with stopping drinking, but actually has to do with patience and being willing to wait for rewards, that's Adam Smith. And finally, I would say courage. And that's what I'm starting to look at now in another project where I'm thinking about John Maynard Keynes, because what he emphasized was the importance of public virtue. Going back almost to what Aristotle was talking about, what can we do for society? And Keynes said, well, the real thing is when the private sector has failed, when the banking system is in meltdown, it's up to governments to take their place and provide investment funds when everyone else is too scared to. So, and that again, if we're talking about people who are interested in Scottish independence, well, there you've got, I think, that courage is absolutely critical to this particular project, because it's going to be, it would be a whole lot easier just to stay within the United Kingdom. But if what you're going to do is to make the leap towards independence, then you're going to need courage.
Yes. Yeah, I would completely agree. Those are all my questions so far. Does anyone else have any questions from the audience, or William?
Robbie, yeah, I've got a question for you. When you're thinking about this, how does an economist think? I would say that there's a whole variety of different schools of economics that think very differently about the main principles that we judge success by in terms of our well-being or our economy. Could you just highlight perhaps some of those very different perspectives on economics that might not have been kind of covered in the kind of classical, the kind of neoclassical approach that, you know, you started earlier? I know I'm thinking about, for example, an ecological economist that sees the world within the confines of the biophysical boundaries, that type of approach.
Yes. Now, to some extent, that's a little more modern than anything I've been thinking about in my book. So, but I think that actually is going to be one of the large debates within economics over the next 30 or 40 years, and probably, and I think that where I think that this is going to be interesting. Or where I think this is interesting in terms of economics is understanding to what extent prices, or what determines the price level. Because what we're going to see are huge changes in the composition of demand And that means that what could well happen is, I'm thinking about within the biophysical constraints that we've got, thinking about how certain activities which we take as being perfectly normal at the moment, like running a car with a petrol engine, will suddenly become much more expensive, and there will be a sudden switch away from that. And with that, what's going to happen is how we create value in the economy is going to change very substantially as well. So I think that what we're getting to, it is, in my mind, it's somewhat similar to what Keynes was thinking about in the 1930s, where Keynes was having arguments with people. Essentially what Keynes was saying, the economy is not as elastic as you think. In fact, in some ways in the 1930s, the economy's become deep frozen. So what we're talking about here, and the point that you're picking up, I think particularly, William, is in terms of planetary boundaries. This is at a very early stage in the conversation. And certainly I would say that there are many economists who are completely relaxed about all of this stuff. Who believe that what's actually going to happen is that the transition will happen, allowing markets to do it. And then on the other hand, I think what we're getting on the planetary boundary side is saying, well, actually, no, we need much more coordination. We need much more agreement. Now, the thing about, if the economy is completely elastic, it will move to its steady state without any intervention. If the economy isn't elastic, it's going to need to be pushed and shaped into and molded into the format that will actually allow us to survive. But I'm not going to try, that's well outside my pay grade.
That's interesting. That's really interesting to hear you say that, because that was a very neoclassical response, which I would expect from a neoclassical economist. So bang on there, talking about price, for example, whereas, an ecological economist think that price plays the absolute tiniest role in allocation, and we need to be talking about pre-distribution and equality. And I think it's amazing when, the audience can kind of think about this huge variety of different ideas within this one definition of an economist. I mean, it's something, it's some wonderful cocktail if you're trying to think of all the ideas that go into economics.
And if I can just on one other one, I mean, you're talking about pre-distribution. Let me throw in one which is extremely important. We're back to justice. And the reason we're back to justice, and it's hard for us to think about justice in this context, is that we're looking at justice across generations. Who represents our great-grandchildren in this debate? How do they get voice in it? And the other one is interspecies justice. Who's going to be representing the rainforest? How does that, so there are all these particular areas that what we're trying to understand pushes us beyond necessarily a human-centered and a present-centered approach. And that is actually where a lot of the discussions which we have, some of the more technical neoclassical discussions come from. But justice is going to be absolutely fundamental in this.
Fantastic. That's great. Okay, we've got a few questions from our audience now. So I'm going to ask. Well, actually, I'll just put this comment up here. Economics is a multiple cultural war between good thinking or wrong turn. We must choose the right, loving, caring thinking to change the economy for good. I think we would all be in agreement of that one. So thanks very much for that, Alexander. Okay, next question. And Ian, why don't we hear from you first? Is applying to join the EU important for an independent Scotland? And then, Robbie, we'll hear from you next on that. Ian, I think you've just unmuted at the moment. I'll just see if I can take you off here. You think you have to unmute yourself? Yeah, there you're good now.
Yes. Rejoining the European Union in some capacity will be very important, whether it's from the European Free Trade Association, which would be the Scottish Currency Group. I think I'm fair to say that on the behalf of the collective group, there is a preponderance of those of us in the Scottish Currency Group who believe that we should apply for the membership of the European Free Trade Association as soon as possible after independence. Rejoining the European Union itself is certainly something to aspire to. we wouldn't, on our current thinking, support joining the euro, not until we have stabilised the economy of an independent Scotland, because we see as key to establishing our post-independence economy, the issuing of our own currency has been vital to actually make the investments we require without interference from other monetary authorities. We don't see any point in leaving the Bank of England as a central bank to join the European Central Bank. We would see ourselves actually issuing our own currency, probably for a period of about 10 years. We do require to issue our own currency for a minimum period of 3 years before we can even apply to join the European Union. But certainly within the Scottish Currency Group, we would like to see ourselves using the ability to issue our own currency to take back into state ownership some of our strategic industries, which we would be able to do with our own currency. And that would be one of our key objectives in the early stages post-independence.
Thank you. Robbie, would you like to give us your thoughts on that?
Okay, so if I think that Ian is absolutely correct when he talks about the challenges which come with currency in the European Union. And I think that that is something that there are all sorts of issues there which will make much more sense to have the conversation about if Scotland is independent. At the moment, there are a whole variety of hypotheticals involved in this. And particularly, I think that the problem which you're going to have with thinking about joining the European Union is that it continues to be to focus on a monetary union rather than on a fiscal union. The reason that's important is that what happens within that is that imbalances build up within the currency bloc. We've already had a couple of fairly serious crises within the Eurozone, and those crises are not bugs, they're design features. So I would be saying that I would say within this that there are that there are two countries very close to us, Sweden and Denmark, which have chosen to retain their own currency. There's another country, Ireland, which has chosen to join the euro and which had a fairly torrid time in 2009 through to 2011, but seems to have managed to recover extremely well since then. So there are lots of upsides, there are lots of downsides to being part of the larger bloc. I think that we would want to be quite careful, and this is something that we've got out of one union. We would have got out of one union which, on the basis that it wasn't working for us. We'd have to be quite careful before going into another one.
Thank you, Robbie and Ian. And yeah, I would reiterate your points there and agree with you. I think the European Union is something to consider much later down the line when we're in a position when we're able to refocus and rebuild our economy, setting our own rules and following our own investment plans. But yeah, certainly our future seems to be drawn more to the continent in the north than it does the south. We've got so thank you very much for that, Kaza. I hope that was a good answer for you there. Let's see. I put this comment up earlier, which I think is quite interesting.
Can I add
but
something?
That's it. So what we should definitely hear, Kieran, from you on your thoughts on the euro as well. Please drop any more questions in, and I'll ask them before we lose the gentleman for this evening.
I just wanted to say that, you know, one of the big reason that I'd like to see Scotland to be an independent country is that it becomes a proper democracy, which is not at the moment. And I think when we get the approval of the majority, a good majority of people of Scotland, that they want to become an independent country, that they want to exchange our own currency with each other, that then when we attempt to go back into European Union, it should be via referendum, and that people should be informed as much as possible, not in the way that there was absolutely no information about how it would work with Brexit, that they absolutely are informed about what the pros and cons are before they go into it. What I don't want to see in an independent Scotland is people saying that they didn't know that this would happen. the way that they're seeing things happen with Brexit. They just didn't know, they didn't understand that these things would happen. So we don't want that in independent Scotland. What I'd like in an independent Scotland is that the polity are as informed as possible before they make these decisions. And that, you know, if we want to then, if we join the European Union and then further down the line, we want to join the Eurozone and be part of that currency, again, that is another referendum where people are given as much information as possible. It's discussed for a couple of years maybe, and then people are fully informed about what it will mean, what the pros are, what the cons are, and that they completely understand that as much as possible. That's what I'd really like to see in an independent Scotland, is a very informed polity.
Great. Again, I'm sure we would all agree with that. I've got another question. Ian, I'm going to put this one to you. So assuming an independent Scotland has plans, policies in place, what are the practical challenges of disentangling an independent Scotland from the UK? Well, it says economics stroke banking. So we'll just concentrate on this kind of financial infrastructure, the disentangling from where we are at the moment.
Yeah, there's a very significant piece of work to be done. You look at the UK's banking history, built up over several hundred years, and you know the actual payment systems within the UK involve all commercial banks that operate in the UK. So, I mean, we have put together positioning papers within the currency group, one on payments and what we have to do to actually, our initial going in position would be to replicate what the UK already has, so in a smaller scale. So, I mean, obviously, the Scottish economy is much smaller than the UK, with 5 million population as opposed to 58 million. But if we can make a comparison with the Irish Republic. Irish Republic, very similar population to ourselves, and its payment systems are were historically very much based on the replication of the UK. So I would reckon there's a couple of years' work to put together the people we need and the programs we need to actually replicate what is already there. It's not brain surgery, but it is a complex piece of work to be done, and will require a lot of careful management. I mean, Robbie is obviously the academic in the group here. I'm very much a practical banker. I've ran big projects in the bank, and these projects take a great deal of management care, attention, and focus. And you need teams of specialist people, both at the technical level and at the management level. We have the capability in Scotland. We have the people in Scotland. Our history in banking is global. We're Scots who established the Bank of India. The Canadian banking system was largely founded by Scots. So I have every confidence that we will be able to do it, but we will need a reasonable period of time to actually put in place the resources and the management capability to replicate the systems that are already used by the UK. Beyond that, we may want to do things differently. But I think in terms of positioning for the independence and the vote on independence, we will go into that on the basis that we will replicate what is already there, so that people know on day one, minute one, after independence, their debit card, their credit card, their CHAPS payments, their direct debits all operate on exactly the same way they do it just now. In my days in the bank, I often actually said that, you know, if your credit card doesn't work when you're in the local shop, it's a bit of an inconvenience, you know, a bit cross about it. But if your debit card doesn't work, that's catastrophic, because you can't buy your petrol, you can't buy your shopping. And so, you know, bankers who are involved in the payment industry understand very, very well the criticality of making sure payment systems work from day one.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ian. I've got a question I'll direct towards you, Robbie. It's of a historical nature, from Charles. Are we not in danger of ignoring Adam Smith's warning regarding allowing individuals and corporates from accumulating too much wealth and power? Firstly, do you agree with Charles that that was a warning from Adam Smith?
Oh, gosh,
and then
yes.
and then if so, are we in danger of following that through?
Right. Okay. So, I mean, just to give a little bit of context, Smith was particularly concerned about the role of the East India Company, which was basically allowed to run India. Well, we're talking about the role of corporates. Essentially, the East India Company could raise taxes, it could raise its own army, it could starve the population, and it did all of these things. It was, as far as Smith was concerned, it was effectively enslaving the entire population of the colonies. So Smith starts off with, it definitely does give us these warnings. Now, I think that the place where we possibly see this most obviously in many ways is in the huge tech companies. And we've talked, you said prices aren't everything, William. Well, one thing which we do know is their share prices, which have roared forwards in the last 18 months or so. And the reason that many of them are becoming much more valuable is because we give them freely huge amounts of valuable information about ourselves. Remember what I was saying about there's two ways in which you can build the economy. One's actually to provide goods and services which are of higher quality, which people actually value and want to purchase. The other way is to trade in reputation. Effectively, what these companies have done is to get us to provide them with the information which will allow them to advise other companies about how to approach us so that we will actually buy their goods and services. So what's happening there is that these businesses have very considerable information and power. They are going to be able to shape much of what we are doing in the world in the next 20 years. And yes, there's a huge question of what the best way is to make sure that we actually keep control of that if we don't want society to be run by a small group of venture capitalists from Palo Alto.
Brilliant, thank you, Robbie. And I'll put a little price comment up for here, so you know our audience is in agreement with you. Prices in supermarkets are levelling up. This Tory government fought for racking up the cost of living crisis by felling through with Brexit that no Scots asked for. A few small statements within that larger statement there. I'll see if we've got any more questions. I've got a short video that I'd like to play. And then ask Robbie and Ian for their thoughts. It's just a minute, but it ties up nicely, I think, this some of the themes that we've covered, especially this idea of institutions and the power of institutions, but also the power of the Scottish government and Scotland as a whole to direct and change its economy. So I'll play this now, and then I'll come back and hear your thoughts. The economic sector comes to you and says, I'm going to push for 2% GDP growth every year over the next decade. How can we do it? What tools have we got with it where we can actually push towards that type of level of growth?
The answer is that it depends what you're fighting against, right? It depends on what the central bank is doing, depends what the Treasury is doing, depends what regional policy is. So imagine you're pushing for 2% growth, whereas the central government is doing something else, right? I mean, you're pushing for it, but the Bank of England doesn't care about unemployment in Scotland, so it keeps interest rates unmercifully too high. And your ideas of trying to generate 2% growth are extremely limited. My view would be that that's a problem. And obviously,
So, Robbie, first of all, that was Danny Blanchflower, who's a former member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, and he's an economics professor at Dartmouth College in the USA. That was his response to the question that I asked him. If Scotland really was able to, and it was pushing for 2% growth, how easy would it be to do that if the UK government wasn't in favour of policies that supported that? What did you think of his response?
Well, growth is one of the things which we really understand least about in economics. And in some sense, 2% growth, well, that is, if we're looking over the last 40 years, that's pretty much the trend growth of the UK economy. So over 10 years, assuming there isn't another pandemic, assuming there isn't another financial crisis, it should probably be achievable. But,
yeah. But I think this point was, if Scotland was pushing for growth and the Bank of England said, no, we're going to put interest, we're going to keep interest rates high and unemployment's going to be high. This idea that Scotland could push for growth whilst Westminster was not interested in developing policies that supported that. I think that's what Danny. That's what Danny was saying.
It depends whether you're taking a macroeconomic or a microeconomic approach to thinking where the sources of growth are going to come from. I think it would be extremely difficult for the Scottish economy to do it, but there are some ways in which the Scottish economy has been systematically underperforming the UK economy. And I'm particularly thinking there about the way in which you've been able to manage job creation, capital formation, the use of the huge bank of skills which people acquire through education and training. I could see ways in which it might be possible to restructure the Scottish economy and get more efficiency out of it. But actually, what we're talking about here, 2% growth is going to be determined largely by the rate of investment, and that rate of investment is going to be determined largely by the interest rate. The interest rate is controlled by the Bank of England, with the Treasury having quite a lot to say about it. Nothing there for the Scottish Government, I'm afraid. So basically, I agree with them.
Great. I got there in the end with you, Robbie. Thanks for agreeing with me there. Ian?
In the long run.
Although we disagree on a lot of that, but we agree on that we'll concentrate on the long run. But Ian, your thoughts on that short section from Danny Blanchflower?
Yeah. No, I think you just emphasise the problem that Scotland's always had. I mean, you can't have a separate economic policy in Scotland when your levers are controlled by Westminster. I mean, it's bizarre to think that a place like the Isle of Man or the Channel Islands, their parliaments have more financial control than the Scottish Parliament. Even in Ulster, the Stormont has more levers of economic power. They can alter corporation tax, etc. I mean, Scotland is in a straitjacket as far as I see things. So, I mean, it's one of the main reasons why I support independence. I mean, we have all these assets, these natural assets, and we actually are not in a position to utilise them to create jobs and improve the lives of our own people. And it's one of the key points as to why we need to have independence. It is about better governance. And actually, I think, as Adam Smith once famously saying, it's about the well-being of the people. That's what we need to do. We need to use our assets for the well-being of our people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Yeah. Ian, I think that's a really good place for us to leave this evening. If I could thank both of you for joining us. It's been a fascinating hour. We've had loads of interaction from our audience. Thank you for your questions and your comments. Thanks so much, chaps. Hopefully I'll see you when I move back to Scotland over the summer, and we'll got lots of things to be chatting about and arguing and debating about as well, Robbie. I think between me and you on a few things. I look forward to that. Thanks so much for joining us, chaps.
And can you also let us know
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, give us some more information when you can about the Scottish Monetary Research Institute. And Robbie, your book is out now, so if people want to buy it, it's available.
Yes, indeed.
The conference is 21st, 22nd of September in the Andrew Carnegie Centre, Dunfermline. But we look up our Facebook page for the Scottish Currency Group for more information. Yeah,
and we'll have an episode about the conference before, probably sometime in August as well. Thanks, gents. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Okay, and we're very lucky to get both of them on the show tonight. It's got dark here. It's not dark in Barcelona, but the sun's dipped down a little bit, so it looks really dark here. but it's not nighttime yet. Yeah, really good conversation. Thanks everyone. Next week we've got an interview that Kieran and I are doing tomorrow, I think, or Wednesday, with Grace Blakely about her book Vulture Capitalism, which we've both read. It's absolutely fascinating. And then the following week we've got an extended interview with Danny Blanchflower, concentrating on well-being. So loads coming up on the show. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Please do like, comment and share, and tell other people about the show. And hopefully we can do, as Kieran said, help inform people about these important economic discussions and decisions that we need to make, not just while we're thinking about independence, but the current constitutional state that we're in at the moment. So thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you all next week. Thanks. Bye for now.